Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is part 2 of the Teddy Atlas Career Profile. Really excited to be delivering this second part to yourselves. I hope you enjoyed part 1, where we got up to the point in the story where Teddy Atlas is introduced to Mike Tyson for the first time, and the story is going to continue from that moment forward. There's so many great stories in the Teddy Atlas Career Profile, so much so that we have had to split it into multiple parts. So we hope that you do enjoy each part independently, and please do make sure that you are leaving us some feedback. If you're on Spotify, leave a comment below when you see the questions and answers box. If you are watching this on YouTube, leave a comment below to let us know what you think about the episode and about the story as a whole. And if you're on Apple and listening on there, please make sure you've left a rating and a review as well. It really, really does help us. If you're not yet following us on social media, you can do so on X at career_profiles and also on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network, Facebook, Instagram and TikTok social media channels. Please do check them out and follow us on there and share any of the videos that I'm putting out there on a regular basis. So we're going to get into part 2 and we're going to continue where we left off in the last episode. And Cus D'Amato, he used the words, "He might be your first heavyweight champ, Atlas," and those words echoed like thunder. Mike Tyson soaked up Cus's words. He smiled at the prophecy. Cus was enamoured with what he saw in Tyson. He said, "We'll make arrangements when he gets paroled for him to come and live with us." He turned to Tyson and said, "Would you like to come live with us?" And Teddy explains this moment in his words. He says, "This all happened within an hour. It was incredibly fast. For someone else, it might have been too fast. But really, when you think about it, what was this kid? With no real home, nothing to go back to. What was he going to say? Especially when visions of fame and glory were dancing in his brain." So Tyson said, "Yes, live where? Your house?" "Yes," Cus replied. "How would you like that? We could arrange that. You could come live with us and become a fighter. You work hard, you could become a champion of the world." Teddy said, "From what I learned afterwards, Tyson kept saying to Bobby Stewart on the way back to Tryon, 'Did you hear what he said? Did you?' Tyson wasn't due to be released for 4 months or so, but Cus didn't want to waste any time. He was lazy about a lot of things. He would eat his tuna fish and watch Barney Miller and walk around in his bathrobe all day. But now, for the first time since I'd been there, Teddy said, he seemed to really wake up and come to life. "Okay, we've got to make sure this gets done, and he comes here to live," Cus said. Cus then enlisted his friend Don Shanager's help because Shanager had a friend in the county office whose approval they'd need before Tyson could be released into their custody. Meanwhile, during the next few months, while the Catskill clan waited for Tyson's official release, Bobby Stewart brought him in every Monday to train with Teddy. "This way," Cus would explain. "By the time he gets out, he'll already be developed to a certain point." Atlas worked with the prodigy, showing him moves and combinations, and he'd go back to Tryon, and in every spare moment he had, he'd practice the things he'd been taught. "I heard a couple of guards found him in his room one night past midnight, grunting and snorting as he shadow boxed in the pitch dark," Teddy said. One condition of Mike being released into D'Amato's care was that he stay for a couple of weekends at the house to gauge how successfully he could integrate into the routine there. Teddy recalls the first visit. He said, "During his first sleepover, we were eating dinner, and the table was crammed with food as usual because Cus, as was his way, had forced Camille to cook too much. I'd helped her count the number of chicken legs we needed, but Cus barged into the kitchen and insisted we needed more. 'I eat 6, he said. "So if everybody eats 6, there won't be enough." "But nobody eats 6 chicken legs." "I eat 6, Cus replied. "And if everybody else eats 6, one person will be left with 5. "No, that's it," Camille said. 30 chicken legs is enough. I'm not cooking anymore." At that point, Cus went into the refrigerator and found a frozen kielbasa sausage to add to the feast. "Cook this just in case," he said. So, we had 30 chicken legs and a big kielbasa sausage, plus mashed potatoes, string beans, peas, carrots, baskets of bread, all of it served in these big heavy dishes that weighed down the table. Tyson was sitting there with his back facing the cabinets, a little bit overwhelmed by the contrast between this warm, beautiful dinner table and what he was used to. Everything with him was yes sir and no sir, and I knew it was all bullshit. In fact, later, when he had moved in, I actually said to him one day, stop with the yes sir, because in a few months you're going to be wanting to say something a whole lot less ingratiating, like fuck you, but you're not going to be allowed to say that, so don't go too far in this direction either. He was a kid who was really the opposite of the image that built up around him later on. He grew up in a rough place and got knocked around. He had no father to look up to. He had a mother who, for whatever reasons, although I don't want to pass too much judgment on her, wasn't able to raise him the way you'd want to raise a kid. And he suffered. He was made fun of and picked on by other kids who called him Stinky Mike because he didn't bathe. By his own account, he avoided getting beat up by hiding between the walls in abandoned buildings, an image that has always stuck with me. The point is, this was a kid with no self-confidence, who had this very imposing physical presence, but underneath, though he tried to project power, felt like a fraud. He was a con man and a predator, which was how we ended up in the reform school. His real crimes, which very few people know about, were against old ladies. He'd go up on them in the projects when they were carrying bags of groceries and ask them in that sweet lispy voice, "Can I help you, ma'am?" Just like he was saying yes sir to me and Cus now. When these old ladies would say, "Yes, thank you, young man," he'd carry their bags into the elevator, and after the doors closed, he'd knock their teeth out and take the money. The difference was, as he was about to learn, not everybody was as gullible or weak as those old ladies. Here at the dinner table, he was nervous. He felt that he was still auditioning because he hadn't yet gotten parole to us. He was on his best behaviour. When Camille said, "Mike, can you get me a fork, please? They're right behind you in the cabinet," he didn't react the way a normal person who was secure with himself would react. He thought that the quicker he got the fork, the more points he'd get. So he jumped up to get it, and one of his legs, and he had big muscular legs, caught underneath the table and literally picked up that end of the table. The food, all those chicken legs and mashed potatoes and everything, started sliding off. I had reached the point in my life in Catskill where I was able to step back a little and observe things in an almost detached way. I was noticing more and more how wacky Cus was, how he was this kind of lovable old crank. There was an odd geometry that described his relationships with Camille and me, and now Tyson. Everyone else, even Rooney, was in the background. Now in the moment, with the table crashing back to the ground and the dishes rattling around and nearly spilling, everyone had a different angle on what was happening. Camille was saying, "Careful, you're going to knock the table over, Mike." Tyson had his hands up, overreacting as if he'd committed a crime, going, "Oh my God, I'm sorry. Cus was saying, "Look at that power. Wow, what savage raw power." And I was thinking, this is weird. This kid is going to be a fucking heavyweight champ. It was just a moment, but it was naked. Everyone revealed in their essence, and for that reason, it stayed with me. Now around this time, Teddy was training another heavyweight in Lenny Daniels. Lenny was in his 20s. He was strong and a good athlete, standing at a sturdy 220 pounds. Despite his stature, Teddy exercised caution when letting him spar with Tyson. Describing his trepidation, Teddy said, "I had to stand in the ring with them and stay on top of them. I had to remind Tyson, have some respect, do not hurt this guy." Then he'd go ahead and hurt him anyway. Even at the age of 14 or 15, Tyson was so strong and so phenomenal that he would hurt these guys no matter what. It was difficult. All my kids meant a lot to me. The thing is, I was training only a few heavyweights that I could put in the ring with Tyson, and he wasn't strong enough emotionally. He wasn't sure enough of himself, so that when I would say, "Go easy here," he would listen to me. After a round, I'd say, "I told you, don't hit them," but he'd still sneak in a hard one, and it was such a vicious, ferocious punch that it would damage these guys. Later on, we wound up paying guys to come down. I remember one day, we got this guy, Melvin somebody, an older guy, a heavyweight, who'd been around a long time. We paid him $25 to spar with Tyson. All I kept thinking was, You got $25, but now you've got to go to the emergency room to get stitches, and that's going to cost you a hell of a lot more than the $25. Cus went up to Tyson on one occasion as he was getting in the ring against another guy we'd hired and said, even though he didn't think I could hear him, make sure this guy earns his $25. So of course Tyson practically knocked the guy's head off, which was what Cus wanted. He wanted Tyson to get that confidence. Cus was Frankenstein creating his monster, whatever the expense to other people. It told you something for the future though. I wasn't smart enough at the time to realise what. The first time Teddy took Tyson down to the Bronx with the rest of the kids was around 1979. When matchmaking the night's bouts, Teddy would meet with some resistance. "Okay, Mike, get on the scale," he instructed. "Okay. 205 pounds, 0 fights, 12 years old," Atlas announced. A furore could be heard rising among the other trainers. 12 years old? Nelson joined the fray. "Teddy, now you went too far." "This beast? This thing here? 12 years old? Teddy, come on." "Nelson, to make you happy, do you want me to put down 16? 16? You see, I knew you were just fooling." Teddy replied, "No, he's 12. But I knew you were going to go crazy, so I guess I got to put down 16 just to appease you." "You're saying he's really 12, replied Nelson. "That's right," Teddy said. Teddy would end up matching the hulkish preteen with a 17-year-old, a Spanish kid with a big afro, who was known to be a considerable fighter himself. Tyson looked spectacular, a perpetual motion machine of relentless non-stop aggression. In the third round, Tyson pinned his opponent to the ropes and detonated a double left hook, one to the body and then bang, a hook to the head. Tyson's adversary fell backwards and collapsed on the bottom strand of the rope, sitting there. He couldn't fall owing to his awkward journey into terminal velocity. Tyson hit him again. The force of the punch snapped his head back, and the water and sweat from his afro went flying into the back of the room and smacked against the wall with a thud. The room wasn't huge, maybe 20 feet across, but the water and sweat flew into the wall, followed closely by the mouthpiece, which landed 6 rows away from the ring. It was a surreal sight. It was a special night. It was Tyson's coming out party, his first real fight. Before the group got back into the cars to drive back to Catskill, Teddy ran over to Santos's bar across the street and called Cus, eager to provide a fight report. Teddy recalled, "He answered on the first ring, so I knew he was sitting there in his chair waiting. He didn't even ask about the other kids. It wasn't, we won 6 fights and we lost 2. The way it was on normal nights, I knew exactly where he wanted to start here. He knocked him out in the 3rd round. He had a good fight. We fell into a rhythm, almost kind of shorthand." Cus's reply would be, "This guy was a fighter then, a good fighter, and experienced. 20 fights?" Teddy would reply, "Between 10 and 15. "Older than Tyson?" Cus replied. 17. Cus's reply was, "And Tyson never stopped moving." Perpetual motion was the response from Teddy Atlas, like a heavyweight Henry Armstrong. Yeah, Cus always said if you could get a heavyweight that could fight like Henry Armstrong, throwing punches non-stop, never giving his opponent a chance to breathe, you'd have a champion. Jimmy Jacobs had all these old fight films of Armstrong, and the two of us had watched them, with Tyson many times analysing Armstrong's style and discussing it. "Imagine," Cus said, "a guy that could move that quick, that could fight with that ferocity and passion. That would be a fighter because he'd be exciting too." Cus never overlooked that. A champion was one thing, but combine that with excitement and you would really have something special. When Teddy tried to breach the subject of how some of the other kids had done, Cus simply reverted the talk back to Tyson. He said, "The punch, the final punch. What was it? A left hand?" "Yes," replied Teddy. "After the double left hook?" "After that." "When he saw he had him hurt, he finished him, yeah?" "Correct." For all these years, Cus had existed away from the limelight, and now it was looming over him again. The tangible anticipation, the excitement of being at the beginning of something big. Teddy said, "I was happy for Cus. At that point, the joy and excitement over Tyson was untainted. It hadn't gone to where it was going to go. I was happy that I was training this guy and contributing. It felt good to be a part of it. That's why I would feel so betrayed later. I thought Cus appreciated my being a part of that good feeling and that we were partners. As far as Tyson, he understood that he had something, a quality and a talent that made him special. He knew he was going somewhere. At the same time, he was scared because he felt like maybe his boxing talent was all he had, and what if it wasn't enough? Our relationship to that point was based on need more than any kind of real feeling. I was his trainer. I was important to him, maybe important than anyone else, because Cus was too old and couldn't do what I was doing. He couldn't be in the gym every day or go to the Bronx. I was the guy Tyson needed to prop him up when he was otherwise alone and scared. But he also had the street understanding of who had the power, so there was no real loyalty possible. Later, he would realise that he was the one with the power. When he was older and more experienced, with a certain level of confidence, he would start playing both ends against the middle. But in the beginning, he was softer and weaker, and he needed me. One of the toughest problems when you have a kid like Tyson, who can destroy other kids in the ring, is finding people to fight him. You have to get him that experience, but word gets around, and nobody wants to put their kid in against him. Cus and I started paying Nelson $50, which he in turn used to get other trainers at the Bronx Club to put their fighters in against Tyson. $50, which is a lot of money for us to sacrifice a kid. Here were these trainers who otherwise wouldn't put their kid in with Tyson, and now for $50, or some portion of that amount, they would. It was screwed up because the kid wasn't getting the money. The trainers were. But that was the reality. We had to get fights. We probably got 20 fights that way, which under the circumstances, once Tyson was out of the bag, was a lot. Eventually, though, there came a night when we couldn't get anybody. To sway one trainer, who was on the fence, I said, make it an exhibition. I knew that an exhibition automatically put it on a different level. It made it more palatable, removed some of the fear. The trainer said, okay, we'll put the big gloves on, 16-ounce gloves instead of the 10-ounce, and we'll use headgear. For Teddy, all that mattered was that Tyson got more experience, that he entered the ring and gained experience. And Tyson went out there, big gloves, headgear and all, and he knocked out his Hispanic opponent. The trainer and his entourage rushed the ring. They were very angry. Hey, you wasn't supposed to hit him, came the anguished cry. Meanwhile, their fighter was still asleep on the canvas. Another guy vaulted into the ring and started moving toward Tyson. Teddy jumped in between them. He said, where are you going? This was supposed to be an exhibition, came the reply. Tyson was standing behind Teddy, ever the charged pit bull. I didn't do nothing to him that he wasn't trying to do to me, he reasoned to the baying gathering audience. This stopped the crowd. They backed down. Not long after that, there was another fight in which Tyson's opponent got in trouble and was hung up on the ropes in a similar manner to when his opponent, who wore the afro, had been stuck on the ropes in Tyson's first fight. The referee tried to intervene this time, however. It was too late. And bang, Tyson hit the kid with another thunderbolt, knocking him out. Again, people were upset. Like the initial night, a crowd stormed the ring and started moving towards Tyson. Teddy jumped in and screamed, I'm telling you right now, you go near him, we got a problem. Well, that didn't stop him. 3 of them were going after Tyson, trying to barge past Teddy. He pushed past one of them, causing him to fall. From there, a riot ensued, which Teddy outlined in his autobiography. He said, oh, it was bad. I pushed this guy because I knew what type of guys they were, and I knew that once a few of them showed some courage and got into it, I wouldn't have any control. It would get completely out of hand. Luckily, Nelson did some quick thinking. I had grabbed one of the other guys by the shirt collar, and he had me by the shirt too. We had our fists cocked, and we were about to start throwing punches, and Nelson jumped in the ring, and he grabbed the microphone. He said, this fight is a draw. It's a draw. It was the perfect move. In the streets, everything is instinct, and flashes of brilliance like that. Calling the fight a draw calmed everyone down. A draw meant that no money would change hands, and that lowered the temperature considerably. The guy I was holding let go of my shirt, so I let go of his. Tyson and I knew who had won the fight, which was all that mattered to us. Tyson got another win. He got some more confidence, and the crowd was placated. Not long after the fight, Team Catskill took Tyson out of town, up to Scranton, Pennsylvania to fight his first white opponent. According to Atlas, it would be an interesting night, living long in the memory. He said, when you're developing a young fighter, no matter how good or talented he is, the one part of him that requires the most work, the trickiest and ultimately the most important factor in determining his future, is his psyche and his will. Whatever else he's got going for him, his mind and his will are the real ingredients of his ultimate success or failure. Against this white kid in Scranton, I knew immediately we were in for a test. The kid was big, not very skilled, but tough. Tyson jumped all over him in the first round, coming out strong as he always did, and knocking the kid down a couple of times. Instead of staying down, though, this kid kept getting up. Tyson had never had that happen to him before. When he hit them, they usually stayed hit. This was new. He got discouraged and started feeling tired. I could see it happening. Tyson came back to the corner at the end of the first round, and he flopped down on his stool like it was the last round of a brutal fight. He had dropped this guy 2 times already. The guy was half out of it, almost drunk from punches, and Tyson had barely been touched. But he was exhausted. I think my hand is broke, he said. I knew, right then, that there was nothing wrong with his hand, but I had to make sure. I grabbed his glove. He was looking into space, and I squeezed real hard. He didn't react. I said, there's nothing broken. The only thing broken is you. I got up in his face. You want to be a fighter? Stop the bullshit. The only thing this guy's doing is being dumb enough to get back up. Every time you hit him, you hurt him. Tyson was looking at me. I could see a flicker of anger, which was good. You going to let it get to you because he keeps getting back up, I said. I pushed him out of the corner as the bell sounded. Tyson dropped the guy 2 more times in the next 3 minutes, but the guy just kept getting up. By the end of the round, Tyson barely made it back to the corner. I can't go on, he said. You can't go on? I thought you wanted to be a fighter. I thought you had this dream of being the heavyweight champion of the world. Let me tell you something. This is your heavyweight title fight. It's amazing when you think about it. You see all those big fights on HBO, but you never see these backwater bouts when a guy is on his way up. And there are these crossroad moments where if he hadn't overcome something, he'd have never made it to HBO. You bullshit artist. You've been with us all this time saying you want to be a champ and everything's fine when you're knocking guys out. But now for the first time, a guy doesn't want to be knocked out. A guy has the balls to get up and you want to quit. You know what I'd be doing if I was in the other guy's corner? I'd be stopping the fight. That's how beat up this guy is. And you want to quit? Now get up, goddammit. I picked him up off the stool and I stood him up. Tyson staggered back into the ring and the 2 fighters grabbed each other. There was a back and forth exchange with Tyson trading blows with his opponent. They began pawing at each other, hugging and moving each other slowly around the ring in a manner akin to a slow dance. With approximately 20 seconds left in the round, Tyson was backed into the corner. Teddy took swift and decisive action, sensing that the end was nigh for Mike Tyson. I took a risk, Teddy said. If you go up on the ring apron, they can disqualify your fighter. I knew that. I also knew that we had amateur refs, and it was a crazy crowd, so I took a chance. I got up there. They were in the corner right by me, and I screamed practically in Tyson's ear, "Don't you do it. Don't you fucking do it." He hung on those last few seconds, and then the bell rang. When we were out in the corridor afterwards on our way back to the locker room, he leaned close to me and he said, "Thanks." And that was it. Nothing else really needed to be said. "Listen," I said, "I'm not going to make a big thing about this. I'm only going to talk about it once. You almost did it. You almost let it happen. But you didn't. You must learn. That's part of being a fighter. The important thing is that you didn't let it happen. If you had, it would have ruined everything. Instead of us standing here, you humbly telling me thank you, you'd be crying somewhere and you'd never be a fighter. You would have looked back and said, oh my God, I didn't have to do that. But you would have done it. It would have been done. So you need to learn from this experience and make sure that you never let yourself get that close to that place again." It was a watershed moment for him, a real defining moment, because if he had quit, then he might never have become Mike Tyson. Cus was at the fight that night, and it was the first time he'd seen Tyson. Obviously, he was disappointed. He saw the power. He saw that Tyson could knock down this bigger, more mature guy who was stubborn as a boulder. But he also recognised that Tyson was still weak, that he wasn't strong mentally, and that we would have to help him to get stronger. At a certain point, if he's going to get to the top of the boxing profession, a fighter must learn the difference between the truth and a lie. The lie is thinking that submission is an acceptable option. The truth is that if you give up afterwards, you'll realise that any of those punches that you thought you couldn't deal with, or those rough moments you didn't think you could make it through, were just moments. Enduring them is not nearly as tough as having to deal with the next day and the next month and the next year, knowing that you quit, that you failed, that you submitted. It's a trainer's job to make a fighter understand the difference, that the parts of a fight that are urgent last only seconds. Seconds during which you have to stave off the convenient excuse, I'm too tired, or I hurt too much, or I can't do this, or even simply, I'm not going to deal with this. Sometimes it just comes down to not floating, just being there and understanding that if you give in, you'll hurt more tomorrow. Maybe there is no more important lesson to learn from boxing than that. Following this potential crisis in 1982, Teddy was spending more time tending to his ambitions surrounding the professional fighters in his camp, namely Kevin Rooney. Cus D'Amato had negotiated a fight for Rooney with Alexis Arguello, the lightweight champion of the world, a destructive force known as the Explosive Finman, who was looking to move up to the junior welterweight division. Rooney was a welterweight, so he'd be in unfamiliar territory and would have to drop 7 pounds, though he saw the fight as the ultimate opportunity to put himself on the map, with Atlas's reputation being enhanced as a byproduct. Teddy began to study tapes of Arguello's fights. He believed that even though Rooney was a big underdog, he possessed the necessary skills to unseat Arguello. Upon studying Arguello's fight against Villamar Fernandez, which took place on the 26th of July 1978, Teddy noted that a skilled boxer could give Arguello trouble. Alexis had many strengths as a fighter. He had power in both hands, and he punched with pinpoint accuracy. He also harboured a weakness that Atlas felt Rooney could exploit. He stood up very straight. He needed to set his feet to punch and couldn't fire heavily on the move, and he also had trouble with said movement. Teddy formulated a plan to keep Arguello off balance, although it would take a perfect performance from Rooney for it to be executed. Teddy's belief that they could pull it off was so strong that it influenced Rooney. Of course, most of Rooney's confidence was inspired by Cus D'Amato, his proverbial Jedi Master. When Cus believed that Rooney could win, that influenced Rooney as well as bolstering Teddy's confidence. Early on in training, Cus arrived at the gym to watch the forgery of the plan in action. When he saw what Rooney and Atlas was working on, he said, "That's why you're the young master. You have a workable plan to win this fight," he said. The only concern in Teddy's mind was the weight. Rooney had never fought below 145 pounds. The positive, as Cus kept on trumpeting, was that Arguello was going to be fighting at a higher weight than he'd ever fought at before in similar uncharted territory, so each side had their own handicap to overcome. Teddy opined on the fight, which would sadly prove calamitous. He said, "Training went well. If anything, Rooney came down in weight too easily. When I asked him about it, he attributed the weight loss to an improved diet. Then during a sparring session one morning, with the fight only a week away, it became obvious something was wrong with him. He was slow and weak. His face was drained of colour. I stopped the workout, put cool, wet towels on him, and made him drink water. It was hot in the gym, so I thought that maybe that was the reason. I started asking him questions, pushing him to tell me anything he'd been doing that might have been the cause. At first, he was reluctant to say anything, but then he told me that every night after training, he'd been going to Brian Hamill's place in Rhinebeck, New York, and sitting in the Hamill sauna. That's how he dropped the weight so easily. I immediately called my father. He told me to bring Rooney to see him. We drove into Staten Island that night, and my father examined Rooney, gave him this stuff called Ensure that replaced all the nutrients and electrolytes that he had lost and gave him a shot of B12. Then he took me aside and said, "He needs to rest. His body needs to recover. It'll take time. Can you postpone the fight?" "It's not that simple. You shouldn't let him fight, Teddy. You're his trainer, and it's your responsibility. You shouldn't let him fight." So we drove back to Catskill, and he explained that situation to Cus. "We have to postpone the fight," I said. "Impossible," Cus replied. "Then we need to pull him out." Cus went crazy. "We're not pulling out. Don't you dare even think about it." We got into a big argument. I knew Rooney wasn't himself. This was a fight where there was no margin for error. We'd have to fight a perfect fight to win. Instead, we were going in knowing ahead of time that something was wrong. I had always deferred to Cus on big decisions like this. He was like the Pope. More and more, though, I was beginning to find myself uncomfortable with some of the choices he was making. In the end, he found a way to appease me. He was a brilliant manipulator. He turned the situation around so I could feel as if I was the one making the decision. He said, "Look, we'll let him spar in a couple of days. If you don't think he's right, then he won't fight." Rooney got back in the ring after resting a couple of days, and he looked better. Not 100%, but better. Still, I saw he wasn't strong. If he's not strong, it'll be like letting him walk into the propeller of a plane, I said. "He doesn't need to be strong," Cus countered. "That's not how this fight will be won. You've given him a plan that doesn't require strength." That was true to a point, and it enabled me to rationalise. Still, I shouldn't have given in. 3 days later, in Atlantic City, Aguayo knocked out Rooney in 2 rounds. In the training room afterwards, I watched my father examine Rooney. It felt like I had beaten him up myself. I knew I could have done something more. I'm not going to tell you that Rooney would have won if he'd been physically fit, but he would have done a lot better. Prior to the Rooney-Aguayo bout, and along with his commitments to his amateur boxing squad, Teddy Atlas had found love in a New York pizzeria after a night of training the boys. The woman, who would later come to be Elaine Atlas, would serve Teddy that night. Elaine, as Teddy described, had dark hair, playful brown eyes and a nice figure. There was an instantaneous attraction between the two, and he explains, he says, "She had a sort of provocative flirtatiousness. She was very confident, and I liked that. Even though she was working behind the counter, I could tell she wasn't going to let anyone push her around or take an attitude with her. I ordered a couple of pies because I didn't have the money for any more, and went back and sat down with the boys. A while later, she came over with a tray full of Cokes. 'I hope you boys are taking good care of your father,' she said. 'He ain't our father,' Manny Moore said, giggling. She looked at me with a little smile. 'He isn't.' He told me he was. When the pizzas came out of the oven 10 minutes later, I went up to the counter to get them. Hot steam was rising off the cheese, and she saw me looking a little perplexed. 'What's the problem?' 'I only ordered 2 pizzas.' 'Oh yeah? I thought you ordered 3. I'll tell you what, why don't you take the extra one, and I won't charge you for it.' 'You don't have to do that,' he replied. 'Yeah, I know. But those boys look pretty hungry.' 'You sure?' Teddy said, and she nodded. Teddy formally introduced himself, and she replied, 'I'm Elaine.' She helped Teddy carry the pizzas back to the table. 'Thanks, Elaine,' Teddy said. 'My pleasure,' was her response. She went back to the counter. Teddy sat down with the boys, and they were all staring at him, grinning. 'What? You like her, don't you?' 'What are you talking about?' Teddy said. They all started laughing and giggling. I looked around the table, levelling them with a stern gaze. 'Shut up and eat your pizza, all of you.' A few days later, Teddy went back to the pizzeria, without the kids this time. Elaine was behind the counter again. 'Hi, Elaine, isn't it? Listen, I wanted to ask you something.' She looked amused. 'I've been thinking of opening a restaurant.' 'You want to open a restaurant?' she replied. 'Well, like a sports bar.' 'A sports bar?' 'Yeah, like a sports bar and a restaurant.' Elaine stared at Teddy. Teddy said to her, 'I thought maybe you could give me some advice.' 'You want advice from me?' 'Yeah, you know, like how to get started.' 'Maybe you should be more direct,' she said. 'What do you mean?' Teddy's response was. 'Well, when you want to ask a girl out.' Oh, well, it threw him a little, that he was so transparent. You think that's what I'm doing? He said. Actually, I thought you'd come back here sooner, she replied. Teddy laughed. She was so cocky that there was nothing else to do. Anyway, that was how it began. Teddy followed her advice and asked her out. Teddy had dated a fair number of girls before her. There'd have been girls that liked him. One girl he even took back to Staten Island during the holidays to meet his mother. She was a gorgeous blonde girl, but a little naive. She'd never really been outside of Catskill. Teddy remembered that they took a ferry boat over to Manhattan to go Christmas shopping in the city, and there was a shoe shine guy on the boat walking around saying, "Shine, shine." Well, this girl started looking around on the floor, under the benches. I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm looking for that man's dog, Shine." Well, you can imagine what Teddy's mother thought when she heard that. She went, "Shine, huh?" Well, with Elaine, it was different for Teddy. She was quick-witted, and she kept him on his toes. And her instincts about people and situations were sharp. Things between Teddy and Elaine got serious quickly. He brought her to the house to meet Camille and Cus, and she brought him to meet her family. Her parents were Albanians who had escaped to Italy from pristine in Yugoslavia right after she was born. When she was 6, her mother and father had come to America, living first in the Bronx and then later moving to Catskill, where they had relatives. Like most Albanians, they were a very tight-knit clan, patriarchal, observant of the old world and customs and traditions. Arranged marriages were still the norm in their culture, and after a girl got married, she would move into her husband's family house and basically became a slave. But Elaine was headstrong and independent, a bit of a rebel. Teddy was the first man she had ever brought home to meet her parents, and he wasn't Albanian. It might have been a problem, except her father adored her, and he made allowances. Following a period of cohabitational bliss, Elaine would announce to Teddy, following the Rooney defeat, that she had fallen pregnant with the couple's first child, prompting him to propose marriage. Teddy would officially have 2 more people in his corner. Whilst Teddy was increasing his breadth of his inner circle, he would swiftly witness its decrease, owing surprisingly to the man that had moulded him as a trainer, Cus D'Amato, and what Teddy felt was his inappropriate handling of his protege, Mike Tyson. Teddy, of course, elaborated on this in his autobiography, Atlas, From Streets to the Ring, and he said, his, as in Cus's, handling of Tyson was what ultimately led to the biggest problems between us. Tyson had begun to grasp that his growing power inside a boxing ring gave him increasing power outside of it. When we went to Denver the first year to fight for the National Junior Olympic title, the contrast between him and his peers was striking. During the weigh-in for a bout, we had to get online with all the other kids. All these 14 and 15-year-old heavyweights who looked their age, had acne, and had no real definition to the muscles. Suddenly we came in, and it was like Clint Eastwood coming down the freaking walkway. The only thing missing was the music. Tyson was up to 210 pounds by then, and he knew the moves. He didn't smile. He didn't talk to anybody. He just walked in, knowing he was intimidating the shit out of these kids. You'd hear them whispering, "Did you see that guy? I'm not fighting him, am I? If I am, I'm getting the fuck out of here." Cus always liked to talk about imagination, how if you let your mind run amok, it would destroy you. Here were these kids falling right into that trap. Teddy remembered a rumour that got started about Tyson that first year, that he was 20 years old and was Sonny Liston's nephew. Sonny Liston's nephew? It was remarkable. He was winning fights before he'd even stepped into the ring. Something else was happening too. Attention and adulation. The first year in Colorado, we were taking buses to get to the arena. By the second year, with Tyson knocking everybody dead, it was, "Can we give you a ride?" It wasn't lost on him. For somebody who wasn't emotionally mature or grounded, acquiring that kind of power was dangerous. In Catskill, more and more, he began to push the boundaries. There were incidents at school. He was assaulting kids and grabbing girls, disobeying and disrespecting teachers. Cus made deals with the school principal to keep Tyson out of trouble. "Listen," he'd tell the principal, "this is a different kind of kid. This kid could make this school and this town famous. We've got to keep this quiet. At the gym and in the house, there had always existed an atmosphere of discipline. It bred consistency and also instilled harmony and balance within the residents. New rules would be convinced upon Mike Tyson's arrival at Catskill, one set for him and one for everybody else. Teddy deplored this change in the long-time status quo. He didn't think that was healthy for Tyson or the rest of the kids. He advised on his stance by saying, "I think that Tyson, like all kids, wanted boundaries. He wanted discipline, but Cus was cutting corners with him. He was in a race against the clock. To discipline Tyson, the only punishment that would have had a real impact would have been to deprive him of time in the ring, the way Bobby Stewart had at Tryon. Cus couldn't afford to lose that time, though. Not if Tyson was going to be the youngest heavyweight champion ever. If Tyson didn't become the youngest heavyweight champion ever, Cus might not be alive to see it. So he indulged Tyson. He forgave and he covered up his indiscretions, even though it was really himself he was indulging. The more Cus excused, the further Tyson played up, and the more out of a loose cannon he became. Cus possessed a fear that he would lose Tyson, either through him dying or by having him taken away. If the authorities in Albany found out about Tyson's troubles, they would act to Cus's detriment, so Cus schmoozed the local populace, ensuring that their lips were sealed. Cus appeased the probation services with reports of a golden child. Tyson was doing great in school and knocking guys out. Teddy was beginning to resent his mentor. He said, all these years of Cus talking about discipline and purity and honesty and the importance of being a professional, and suddenly it was like, oh wait, I didn't mean that, or I only mean it when it's convenient. I had become dangerous to Cus because I had brought into what he had been preaching. When Tyson got into trouble for throwing containers of milk at the wall in the school cafeteria, it was just the latest in a string of incidents. I'm not saying I'm a saint. I stood by and watched him get away with stuff. At a certain point, though, I reached my limit. I decided to suspend Tyson from the gym until he shaped up and improved his behaviour. Maybe it was too late, and I was just trying to make myself feel better. Maybe it wouldn't have done any good anyway. Tyson certainly didn't submit to it. He went straight to Cus, who not only didn't back me up, but brought Tyson to the gym himself the next morning and let Rooney train him. For the 4 years I had been Tyson's trainer, I had given him a mixture of support, guidance and discipline. Now Cus, whether I was right or wrong, was undermining me. A 6-year partnership between the two of us based on loyalty and trust and the dream of developing a gym and championship fighters was going out of the window. Rooney, my childhood friend, he took Cus's side. He thought I was the one being disloyal. However you looked at it, it was obviously an untenable situation. Cus and Rooney were working with Tyson in the morning, and I was working with the other kids later. Something had to give, or someone. You'd think there would have been some other way to resolve things. You wouldn't think it all had to blow up. But that's what happened, and Tyson was at the centre of it. Tyson's increasing slide into anarchic behaviour led to perhaps the most famous interaction between man and boy. It presented a grim ending to what could have been a fruitful association for Teddy with Tyson had it continued into the world of the professional ranks. Following an extended period of tension in the Catskill lair, Teddy returned home, whereby his ears would hear the end of a harrowing conversation. In Atlas's words, he describes what happened this one fateful moment. He said, I came home one night, and Elaine and her sisters were sitting in the kitchen crying. Elaine said, don't say nothing to Teddy. Of course I heard her. There was no way they were going to keep it from me after that. Don't say nothing about what? Elaine was more than 6 months pregnant at this point. She didn't want to see me get upset. She was worried about the baby. Say nothing about what? I looked from her to her sisters. Nobody would say anything at first, but then one of Elaine's sisters reluctantly revealed that Tyson had done something to their 11-year-old sister Susie. I didn't go crazy right away, which for someone who knew me might have been scarier than if I had. Very calmly, I pushed for details. Tyson had grabbed Susie. He'd put his hands on her, told her what he wanted to do to her. I knew it wasn't a random thing. Tyson, with his street instincts, knew exactly what he was doing and what would happen. It was a game, and he was playing it hard and mean. He understood power and weakness as only someone who had spent part of his childhood hiding between walls could. I had been the only one at the gym demanding that he abide by the rules of society. Now, he was throwing that back in my face and saying, "Fuck you, we'll see who wins that battle." I looked around the kitchen at Elaine and her sisters. They were all crying, except for Elaine, who was furious. The idea that one of my kids had done this was nearly unfathomable. Without saying anything, I headed for the door. Elaine ran after me. "Teddy, don't." I shrugged her off and I kept going. This was what had come of Cus taking Tyson's side. This was the ultimate move on Tyson's part to show that he had no respect for boundaries, authority, or anything. He was finishing it off because of where Cus had let him go. At that moment, I hated Cus every bit as I hated Tyson. I had trusted Cus. We were partners. I felt very emotional. But in an ice-cold way, I knew that if I allowed this, next time Tyson would take it further. He would rape her. Or someone else. I drove into town to this place called Asti's, a disco owned by a friend of mine named Bobby Cargioli. He had an apartment upstairs where I knew he kept a gun. I parked in the lot and went up the wooden stairs by the side of the building. Bobby was standing in the door of the club. He saw me. He walked a few steps closer. "Teddy, what's going on?" "I came to get your gun." "Are you giving it to me, or am I taking it?" Whoa, slow down. What are you talking about?" Well, I ignored him, and I kept going. The door to his apartment was open, and I went straight for the bedroom. That's where he kept the gun, under his mattress. It was a .38 revolver. I flipped the chamber open and saw it was loaded, flipped it back, and stuck the barrel in my pants. Bobby appeared in the doorway. "I don't want nothing to happen, you understand?" "It's too late for that," I replied. "Where are you going to go with that?" "Nothing's going to come back to you," I said. "If that's what you're worried about." I walked past him and out the door, and I drove to the gym. But Tyson wasn't there. The kids were starting to loosen up, skipping rope and shadow boxing, working the bags. I went to Kevin Young. "You seen Tyson?" "He's probably home." Kevin picked up on the edge in my voice. "Is there a problem?" "No," I replied. "You want me to call him and ask him to come out?" "He's always looking to get out." "I'll call him and ask him." Kevin was a tough kid, as loyal as they come. He was like Joe the Blade that way. "No, Kev," I said. "You just stay here and loosen up and run things for me tonight." I walked down the stairs and outside and saw a cab pulling up. I stepped back into the shadow of the building. It was Tyson. I crouched down and waited. He walked up to the door of the building. I sprang out of the darkness and grabbed him by the neck of his shirt. I put the gun to his head. "You piece of fucking shit." I pulled him into an alcove between the gym and the next building. "You think you're going to do that to my family? After the way I've treated you? I will fucking kill you. That's my family. My family. You understand, you fucking piece of shit?" I was looking at him, staring straight into his eyes. If he didn't show me that he knew how serious I was, then I was going to kill him. "Make no mistake, if you ever put your hands on my family again, you'll be dead. There'll be no talking, no warning. You'll never know. You'll just be dead." I was looking for a sign of understanding, and I wasn't getting it. There was still a smugness about him. I stuck the gun in his ear and I cocked the trigger. I said, "Are we clear? Do you see the reality of this?" He gave me a nod. Jerking the gun barrel up in the air at the last moment, I pulled the trigger. He fell to the ground holding his ear. "Are we absolutely clear now? I will not let you do this to my family. I will not live this way, and I will not let you do this." He got to his feet. When I looked into his eyes, this time the understanding was there. I watched him stagger away. "You better not forget." From what I heard later, Tyson vowed he was going to kill me after that, but Cus hustled him out of Catskill for a few weeks up to Bobby Stewart's in Johnstown, and either he was talked out of his vow or he lost his nerve. The way things had been going even before this happened, it's quite possible that Cus had been plotting his next move regarding me for a while. A couple of days after the incident, the doorbell rang. It was Don Shaniger. "What do you want?" I said. I suppose on some level, I was still hoping that Cus would be the person I wanted him to be, that he pretended to be. I held out some vain hope that when push came to shove, he would actually be the stand-up guy a lot of people thought he was. "Can you come out and talk?" Shanika said. Elaine was standing with me. She was nervous. The baby was due soon, and she wanted to be sure that the baby's father would still be around. "He wants me to go out and talk," I said. "About what?" she replied. "I don't know. He didn't tell me, but I'm going out." She stood there by the door while I went outside. A chill November wind was blowing fallen leaves across the yard. "Cus told me to give you an offer," Shanika said. The confusion must have shown on my face. "To leave," he said. It hadn't even occurred to me. They were going to pay me off the way they paid everyone else off. Cus said he'll give you 5% for life of all Tyson's future earnings if you just go away. "He authorised you to do this?" I said. "Yes. He realises that Tyson was wrong. He knows all the hard work that you've put in and that you brought him to this point, and he's sorry that things worked out this way. So he's willing to give you 5% for life." 5%? That's very generous. It really is. You know what you can tell him? To go fuck himself. Tell him I don't want his money. I went back inside and slammed the door. Teddy wouldn't leave immediately, however. He was overseeing the training of 7 fighters that were competing in the finals of the Adirondack Golden Gloves in Schenectady, New York, the date of which was a week after the incident with Tyson. Teddy thought long and hard about his predicament. Finally, he went to the gym and trained them, choosing commitment over folding to strong-arm tactics. Teddy accompanied the boys to Albany, heading up a successful trip with 6 out of the 7 of his boxers recording a triumph at the event. The day after the tournament's end, Teddy went to the gym to say goodbye. The inhabitants stood there, silently displaying no emotion or putting forth a single utterance. Teddy had been their teacher for 5 years, and there was a pregnancy in the deafening silence. A tacit understanding that Atlas had no choice but to depart. The sad moment is retold, of course, by Atlas when he said, "They knew everything without me having told them. They knew what had happened with Tyson. They knew about the gun. They knew about my sister-in-law. They knew everything. Nobody could lie to those kids. Nobody could bullshit them. They knew everything. A few of them said, 'We'll come with you.' They wanted me to open another gym in Catskill. I said, 'No, you can't do that.' I thought I was leaving Catskill, to be honest, so I told them no, and I said goodbye to them. Suddenly, they handed me a plaque. I don't know when they had it made up, and it said, 'To Teddy Atlas, our trainer and guide, who has treated us like men, and one who has been like a father to us. We will miss you.' We all walked out of the gym together. I'd had these kids since they were 11, 12 years old. It was funny. Sometimes you didn't realise how much time had passed in your life until something marked it for you. Teddy's daughter, Nicole, was born on the 3rd of April 1983, in an upswing to Teddy's personal turmoil. He was elated, and his new baby heightened his need to make a living for his growing family. He said, "So many people came to visit that the hospital was overwhelmed. They put up signs on the second day, 'No visitors for the Atlas baby.' I had friends who drove up from the city, walking around the halls, smoking cigars and drinking beer. They had never seen anything like it in that hospital. So, Nicole was born, and a lot of things were different in my life, and it was time to go. It had been 6 years in Catskill. Now it was over. A lot of things were different. I was a husband and a father, and certain things had to come to an end. We packed up and moved to Staten Island, me, Elaine, and the baby, into the basement of my parents' house, and I started looking for a way to make a living training fighters in New York. As soon as the Atlas family got unpacked and settled into their new apartment, Teddy went to a gym in Brooklyn that was situated above the Walker Theatre where his friend, Nick Baffy, was working. Nick was an old friend of Cus D'Amato, whose Teddy met in Catskill during his tenure there. He invited Teddy over upon hearing of his arrival home. Teddy quickly found his feet, tutoring a couple of fighters there after they sought his services. One of the boxers was Johnny Verderosa, a man on the comeback trail. Johnny knew Atlas well, and had done so since they were kids on Staten Island. Teddy had sparred with him, helping him get into shape when he was training for the New York Golden Gloves. Johnny was only slight at 130 pounds, but was quite the sportsman. His father was an alcoholic and his two brothers were drug addicts, leading Johnny to be seduced by the clean life and choosing fighting over a lack of social function. "I'm taking care of my body," he'd chime in with pride. His addiction was sports. Football, baseball, boxing, especially boxing. He won the New York City Golden Glove title twice and then turned pro and became the USBA super featherweight champ. Of Johnny, Teddy said, "A lot of people, his mother in particular, were proud of him. And just like that, just when he was in that position and it seemed like his discipline and hard work were paying off, he began doing cocaine and doing it openly, doing all the things he said he was never going to do. It was baffling. On the verge of real success, he took this 180-degree turn. I don't know if it was guilt that he was leaving his brothers behind, or if all that discipline was finally too exhausting. I just know you can drive yourself crazy trying to figure out stuff like that. When his manager approached me, it was after the drugs had already dragged down his career and he was trying to revive things. He asked me if I would help him, so I agreed, provided he stayed clean. I knew it wasn't an easy thing for him, so I had him stay with us, with me, Elaine and the baby at the house, so he could have the support. I gave him a curfew and stayed on top of him. It worked. He got into shape and he won a couple of fights. Then right before his third fight, he came home one night while I was out training another fighter. He told Elaine not to tell me, but he was going back out. When I got home, I asked her where he went, and she didn't know. I knew something was up. I went driving around the neighbourhood to all his old haunts trying to track him down. I walked into this one bar where I heard he sometimes used to go and cop cocaine. I went up to the bartender and I asked him if Johnny Verderosa was around, and he said no. But I knew it was a lie because he was nervous. I saw his eyes dart over to a corner of the room. In the reflection of the mirror behind the bar, I saw Johnny cowering on the floor behind a pinball machine. As mad as I was, I didn't say anything. I just walked out as if I hadn't seen him. About midnight that night, he came home. I was up, waiting. I didn't waste any time. I got right to the point. "I saw you," I said. "I know what's going on." I didn't have to say anything else. He knew why I hadn't said anything earlier, that I hadn't wanted to embarrass him. "You don't have the discipline it takes to be a fighter anymore," I said to him. And he didn't argue. He didn't fight with him. His head was down. He was ashamed. He said, "I'm sorry. You took me in and I let you down. I betrayed you." Teddy's response was, "No, you betrayed yourself." This was a kid that Teddy had had living under the same roof with him and his family. A kid who had told him how much it meant to him to not have to sleep with cotton in his ears, which he had to do where he'd been staying before so that the cockroaches wouldn't go into his ears. Teddy had been training and feeding him and really trying to straighten him out, and it tore Teddy up to see him slip back. Even though it was something that Teddy thought he understood a little from his own life, maybe he didn't understand it as well as what he wanted to. Johnny fought his next fight against Miami's Kel Robin without Teddy's watchful eye in the corner, and he was knocked out in the 9th. He called Teddy a few times after that, asking for money. Teddy would respond with generosity, giving a few dollars here and there. Johnny would assert that the handouts were going to be spent on food, though Teddy knew better. He knew it was for drugs. The next time Johnny asked, Teddy snapped at him, declaring, "I ain't giving you a cent. If you want something to eat, if you're hungry, I'll sit with you. I'll take you to a diner and I'll buy you dinner. But I ain't giving you no money. I'll take you to a drug rehab. I'll help you get in, and when you're allowed a visit, I'll come visit. Or if you're not allowed a visit, I'll write. Whatever it takes to make you feel a connection." Johnny's boxing career ended after the knockout with a respectable 27-3 record. He retired after that, but eventually after drifting for a few years, he cleaned himself up. He found himself a girlfriend and he started working in construction and stayed afoot the sober path. Following the split with Johnny, Teddy started going to the old Gleason's gym over on 31st Street between 7th and 8th. He'd board the ferry and the subway and go in there every day, spying the latest talent. He would command a few amateur fighters in a scenario reminiscent of his Catskill days. Rebecca, the head man at Gleason's, was aware of Teddy's talent and his eye for a winner, and he knew of Teddy's former association with Cus D'Amato. Teddy Atlas remembers these days in his own words, and he says, "This was in the early 1980s, when the whole white-collar boxing craze was beginning. These Wall Street guys were showing up at Gleason's paying good money to learn how to box. A lot of them wanted to work with me, but I always rejected them. Truthfully, it wasn't smart on my part. It didn't make financial sense to say no. But I was coming from a place, having worked with Cus, that I was a professional trainer who would make world champions, and that there was a purity to do what I was doing." You grow up. You get over this kind of thinking. You realise that you don't have to compromise yourself to make money along other avenues. That it's okay and can even be another level of your trade, teaching and developing guys who would normally never have a clue or chance in the world. But that's the way I thought back then. I was the young master, and I was fulfilling my destiny, and it didn't include these white-collar guys. Rebecca, used to go up to Teddy and say, "Teddy, do me a favour. Can I talk to you? Why don't you take some of these guys?" Teddy understood where he was coming from. These guys were asking for Teddy, and he was rejecting them, and he wanted their membership, and he didn't want to lose them. He said, "Listen, there's this Spanish guy that trains 10 guys in a class each morning and makes $150. You could get $300 easily." Teddy should have done it. He was living in his parents' basement, he had an infant daughter. There was plenty of good reasons, but he kept saying no. It was just the way he was thinking of where he was at that time. There was a guy that he knew called Rudy Greco, an attorney who was involved in the boxing business, and he came up to Teddy and said, "I have an interesting proposition for you. Do you know who Thyla Twarp is?" "No." "Well, she's the Muhammad Ali of dance. And I just got a call from somebody that she needs to get back into shape to dance. She decided she wants a boxing trainer, and your name came up. I think you should do it." Teddy replied, "I ain't training no ballet dancer." "Teddy, just do me a favour, just talk to her." Well, Rudy Greco started talking more about her, telling Teddy how much of a famous dancer she really was. She'd done this musical called Hair on Broadway and a bunch of other things. Being a lawyer, he made a good case. The truth is, Rudy knew what Teddy's financial situation was like, and he was looking out for him. The persuasiveness of Greco, plus the $35 an hour Teddy stood to make, well, he got Teddy to agree to talk to her. Tharp called Teddy a couple of days later, and he made an appointment to meet her. Teddy still had keys to the Walker Theatre in Brooklyn, Nick Baffy's gym, so he arranged to meet her there. She was both grateful and apologetic. She said, "I know this all must seem a bit silly to you. I'm a dancer and you're a boxing trainer." At the same time, she reassured Teddy about how sincere she was about undertaking the assignment. Teddy said she was very gracious and humble. It was smart of her. She won me right over. Right off the bat, she asked me lots of questions about the philosophy of boxing, and I told her about dealing with fear, controlling emotions, and how those were the things that could be transferred to other disciplines. Well, it appealed to her. She was 44, which was old for a dancer, and she was getting ready to perform for the first time in a while. She had a lot of pride, ego, and professionalism, and she wanted to be in better shape than she had been when she was in her 20s if that was possible. Teddy confirmed that it was possible. He said, "I'm willing to teach you boxing for 2 reasons. 1, so you can have the ability to undertake a physical regime with it, which entails learning enough technique so that you can get the benefits of this workout. And 2, so that you can learn how to go into dark places and not get broken down. I think that would help you. If you can learn a bit of that discipline that the fighters learn, and you can take that onto the stage with you." So Teddy created a program for her. He made her run up and down the steps in the Walker Theatre. She would skip, do push-ups, kick-outs, sit-ups, everything that Teddy expected of his competitive personnel. He worked her to the bone, and she staunchly handled everything, never grumbling. The first time Teddy had a slip a punch, he said, "Listen, I'm going to throw a punch at you. Now, athletically, I know how talented you are, and the move you need to make is obviously something that you can do, but there are other elements involved." As he explained the mechanics of moving her upper torso and how she might instinctively want to turn away, but she would have to resist in doing so, Twyla smiled. Teddy said, "Why are you smiling?" "Because it's so simple," she replied. "I'm a dancer. I make moves like that all the time." "Yeah, you think it'll be easy?" said Teddy, responding with that challenging tone to his voice. "I'll make you a bet right now," he said, "that when I throw a punch, you can't do it, okay?" Teddy told her to put her hands up, and when he threw a punch, she drew it back from it instinctively. "Wait a minute," she said. "Let's try that again." Teddy was smiling. He unleashed another punch. Again, she turned away from it. "What happened, Twyla?" asked Teddy. "I thought it was a simple move." She feigned offence, offering a compliment. "You're not treating me like a lady, Teddy," she retorted. "It's interesting, isn't it?" replied Teddy. "You know, I'm not really going to hurt you, but just the idea of my punch, the danger it represents, is enough to screw you up. That shows you where we're going. Learning to contain that emotion, not to pull back, not to close your eyes, but to face what you have to face and slip the punch. This isn't about anything but the physical action. You're not thinking about avoiding getting hit or worrying about being hurt. You're just focused on the action of the move. This isn't so you can become a prize fighter, but so you can become a better pro. So you're better equipped to deal with anxiety and fatigue and fear on stage." She understood, and she learned. She would soon be slipping punches. She was good. Teddy would start to take her on the focus mitts and would also strike her freely as an exercise to encourage readiness and reflexes. Teddy described the hazards of this action. He said, "One time, she didn't move and I hit her. She got a black eye. She wouldn't put makeup on or anything. I felt a little bad. She said, 'Are you kidding me? I'm going to make sure everyone sees this.' I heard later that our dancers began calling her Boom Boom Tharp." At the other end of the spectrum, when I wrapped her hands for her, she said, "Remember, I am a lady and I like these nails. It's important for my hands not to look like a fighter's. Anything else, fine, but make sure my hands are protected. Don't worry," I'd say, "your nails will still be beautiful when I take the gloves off." "Are you sure?" she replied. "I'm sure," Teddy said. We worked 5 days a week for nearly a year, and she got into great shape. At a certain point, we moved out of the gym, and I began training her at the American Ballet Theatre, right on the polished wooden floors where her dancers started arriving at the studio towards the end of our session. She introduced me to them. She was both sweet and self-deprecating. This is Teddy Atlas, who has allowed me to take up a little space in his world, even though I embarrass him. Afterward, she would ask me to stay and watch her rehearse. Her company, in part, I think, because she wanted me to see what she was like when she was giving orders and not taking them. Twyla took some of the moves she'd learned from me and put them into one of her dance pieces. I don't know if she had that in mind before the training, but she made this piece called Fate Accompli, using the boxing movement. When it premiered in November 1983, she flew me and Elaine down to Washington. We got all dressed up and went to the opening night at the Kennedy Center. We were sitting in the front row, and you know the kind of people who go to these things, not the fight crowd, and right behind us, when Twyla came on stage for the first time, this guy exclaimed, "My God, she looks like a champion fighter." Elaine hit me in the side with her elbow. "You hear that?" "Yeah." "Is that a good thing?" "What do you mean? Of course it's good. Not if she dances like Sylvester Stallone." The truth is that Twyla really did look sensational. Her muscle tone, her whole aura. He hadn't realised how different that she had looked until that moment. Under the lights, she glowed. When the performance was over, she got a standing ovation. People were cheering and throwing roses up on stage. Teddy came prepared, having learned beforehand that it was a tradition to throw flowers up on stage. While Twyla was taking her bows and the crowd was applauding and she was looking out, she looked at Teddy with this big smile. Teddy walked up, took a pair of boxing gloves out of a bag that he had brought with him and threw them up on stage. People were saying, "Look at that." I guess you don't see boxing gloves thrown up on dance stages too often. A couple of years later, Teddy was training Simon Brown, who was the welterweight champ, and he was getting ready to make a defence of his title. They were in the locker room before the fight, and flowers came in, which was unusual. Don Elbaum, the fight promoter, said, "Teddy, you got flowers. Someone sent you flowers." Of course, it was Twyla. Teddy had begun making a semblance of a living from boxing after years of dedication. Eventually, Teddy and Elaine were able to move out of Teddy's parents' basement and into an old brick building up on Grimes Hill, where they paid $300 a month for a one-bedroom with dark wood floors. During their tenure there, Elaine would give birth to the couple's second child, Teddy Atlas III, in May of 1985. Gradually, Teddy's reputation was on an incline. He started training talented fighters of the time, such as Tyrone Jackson and Chris Reed. Teddy became acquainted with Reed, New Jersey's Shamrock Express, through British boxing behemoth Mickey Duff, who was managing him. Teddy Atlas had such admiration for Mickey Duff's acumen. He said, "I considered Mickey one of the 5 smartest guys in the sport. A wily and successful promoter, he looked like a jovial Irishman and had an Irish name, but in fact he was Jewish. His real name was Monek Praga. His father was a rabbi, and he had been born in Krakow, Poland in 1929 and owned a kibbutz in Israel. Mickey was a lovable rogue who could swim with the piranhas, but he was also pretty straight shooter as well, which is to say, he wouldn't steal you blind. I first met him in Catskill when he brought a young Frank Bruno to spar with young Mike Tyson. He was complimentary of my work as a trainer, which was very flattering coming from a guy like him who had done everything you could do in boxing, from being in the ring as a fighter, a cornerman, matchmaking and promoting. Reed was the first American fighter that Mickey had ever managed. He was a quiet, serious kid with dirty blonde hair, blue eyes and a moustache. You didn't realise how decent a kid he was until you met him and spent some time with him. His sulliness could be a little off-putting, but it was just protective. It wasn't who he really was. In fact, he was a caring and loyal individual who had the ability to recognise and appreciate those traits in others. His standoffishness mostly came from being a white kid in a primarily black sport. You'd never have guessed Chris was an explosive puncher. Certainly not to look at him. He had those long Irish arms with absolutely no muscle tone. It was a misleading physique. He was like a little human missile silo, explosive power inside an innocent-looking facade. In our years working together at Gleason's, Chris used to just destroy other fighters in the gym. He was legendary. All the best fighters who came through there, guys from Puerto Rico, guys who had never lost a fight, boom, he knocked them all dead. People walked around saying, "Oh, he's a monster." He was. He could punch like a bastard, and he wasn't afraid to let loose at the right time. He was a hard worker too. He listened well. Just to give you an idea of his commitment, every day he would travel from Little Silver, New Jersey, which is on the Garden State Parkway. He would take the train 4 or 5 hours a day, back and forth, and he was never late, not once in 4 years. If he hadn't had a drinking problem, there's no telling how far he could have gone in boxing. Teddy and Chris extended their association until Chris Reed's career record stood at a sturdy 18-0 with 17 knockouts. There was talk that Reed was to face off against the seasoned light heavyweight campaigner Marvin Pops Johnson for the WBA championship, though that rumour was quashed when Johnson would instead face off against Trinidad's Leslie Stewart, who would force the old Warhorse Johnson's corner to retire him in the 8th round. Teddy would later reflect on his relationship and his time with Chris. He said, "Sometimes that's just the way it goes." A month later we landed Chris a non-title fight against Fulgencio Olbermayas, who had twice fought Marvin Hagler for the title. We thought it was the right fight for Chris, but we were wrong. The fight was at the Garden and Chris got dropped 6 times, but the crazy bastard just kept getting up until he got stopped for good in the 10th. Strangely, he was ahead on all the scorecards even after all the knockdowns. In the aftermath of losing out on the title shot and then losing to Olbermayas, Chris started drinking more heavily. Sometimes he'd leave the gym and never even make it home. He'd go to Times Square and wind up drinking in some dive Irish bar all night. A couple of times he came straight to the gym afterward without going home, and when he sweat, I could smell the booze. He couldn't understand how I knew what he'd been doing, but I knew because his sweat stank of booze. Part of the problem with him was the Irish thing. He was the Shamrock Express, and he had this big Irish following, and they'd play the bagpipes when he came into the ring. It was nice, but it had kind of created an expectation. It taught me something about human psychology, that no matter how you're perceived, no matter what people see on the outside, what's inside you could be completely different, and probably is. Inside, Chris was unsure of himself. He was afraid that he wasn't living up to his potential. So he drank to hide from that and to have an excuse to lose. The sad part is that we got through some of those issues. I helped him get sober. He got control of his life. When an opportunity came up to fight Graziano Roccagiani, who was the IBF super middleweight champion, we took it. Chris deserved the shot, and we gave it to him. The fight was in Berlin, and Mickey sent the two of us over to Europe 3 weeks early so that we could train there and get acclimatised to the time change. Now, Mickey wasn't known for being a lavish spender, and this wasn't a fight with a big purse for us, so to save money, even though the fight was in Germany, we went to England to train in the Thomas Beckett gym. It was a famous gym on the second floor over a bar. On the floor above, there were 3 tiny rooms with no heat that were basically like rooms in a flop house. You had to go downstairs to shower or use the bathroom, so that's where we stayed. Me and Chris in adjoining cells. When I talked to Mickey on the phone, he said, "It's not the Ritz, is it, Teddy? It's not even the It's," I said. "That's good, Teddy," he replied, and that was the kind of relationship that Mickey and Teddy had. He said it'll toughen you up for the fight. The thing was that Mickey and I both felt, even though there wasn't the money to do things first class, going over early still gave Chris his best chance to win the fight. Chris appreciated that, and he thanked Teddy, and he said, "I know you're making no money, and you have to be away for your family for 3 weeks in a place that's not even nice." Teddy's response was, "You just concentrate on what we came here to do." We found some space heaters to warm up the rooms a little bit. The only problem was they emitted these fumes, so one of us would have to remind the other to turn them off before we fell asleep, or we'd get asphyxiated. We'd also use the heaters to dry out the wet workout clothes that we'd wash in the sink downstairs. Chris and I were together all the time during those weeks. We ate together, slept in adjoining rooms, did road work together, went to the gym together. All the Brits admired the diligence of our training regime. At night, we would go out to eat, maybe take a walk around the neighbourhood, and then head back home. We were in the North End, which was supposed to be a rough area. People warned us about walking at night, but we didn't care. We walked everywhere, through parks, down dark streets, everywhere. Sometimes we'd treat ourselves to a movie. We were inseparable for those 3 weeks. We were on a mission together. We talked about what it meant. I'm not sure we ever said it in so many words, but we both knew it was Chris's last real chance to salvage his career. The bar downstairs from the gym was owned by this guy Gary Davidson, who was an ex-fighter, who turned it into something of a museum. There was all this great boxing memorabilia, Henry Cooper's trunks from when he fought Ali, a pair of the heavyweight Joe Bugner's gloves, facsimile copy of the Marquis of Queensberry rules, all this great stuff. On Fridays and Saturdays, the bar would turn into a discotheque. It got packed and rowdy. One Friday night, Teddy and Chris walked back after dinner, and Teddy dropped him off at the quarters. He said, "I'm going to take a bit more of a walk." Chris's reply was, "Okay, Ted, I'll be upstairs." "Make sure you turn off the heater," I said. "Don't want you to suffocate to death a week before the fight." When I got back from my walk, the side door that we usually used to get into the residence bar was locked, so I had to go through the bar. The bouncers stopped me. They wanted me to pay the cover charge. I tried to explain the situation, that I was staying upstairs and the side door was locked. The lead bouncer shook his head. He said, in a British accent that wasn't as nearly as friendly as Mickey Duff, "You're not getting in without paying, mate." I tried patiently to make my case, but he wasn't listening, and one thing led to another, and soon we were scuffling. The fight moved from the doorway out onto the streets, and by the time his fellow bouncers joined in, Teddy had issued the head doorman with a hiding. He was still battling with the other bouncers when the police arrived, each wielding a truncheon, convincing Teddy to immediately stop throwing punches. It was clear right away that Teddy was in trouble, that the police assumed that he was the aggressor. Couple that with his American accent, and Teddy felt victimised. And he recounts the night. He says, "They started trying to manoeuvre me into the back of the paddy wagon. As much as I was entranced by it, I knew I didn't want to see it from the inside. I was saying, 'I ain't going in there. I ain't fucking going in there.' And they were saying, 'Yes, you blooming are, Yank.' Just when it was getting bad and they were starting to muscle me into the back, the manager from the bar came out. He said, "Leave him alone. He's in the right." He explained who I was and what had happened, and he basically told the bobbies that the whole situation was the bouncer's fault. So the police let him go. It turned out that the manager had no great fondness for the lead bouncer and his crew, nor did any of the bar's patrons who had been abused and hassled regularly. They all tried to buy Teddy a drink, but he wasn't drinking because of Chris. "You sure gave him a good shellacking, Teddy," the manager said. The next day, word got around. Chris heard about it, but he didn't say much more than, "You all right?" which was his way. That night, they went out for dinner, as usual, and when they got back around 8 o'clock, the bar was starting to get busy. Gary Davidson, the owner, was there, as was the manager, and right away the manager said, "Teddy, can we talk to you for a minute?" Chris's loyalty kicked in immediately. "Are they back?" Well, Chris was ready to get into it. "Oh, no," said the manager. "They're never coming back. They want no part of him, believe me." "That's the thing. It's not your fault, Teddy, but because of what happened, we've got nobody to work the door tonight." "Oh, I'm sorry," Teddy said. "I didn't intend to create any headaches for you." No, you did us a favour. You got rid of that arsehole. It's just that we were wondering if you could stand in tonight." "Stand in?" Teddy replied. "Work the door. Be our protection." Chris had a big smile on his face. He was shaking his head. "We'll pay you," the manager said. I couldn't believe my ears. "I'm training for a world title," I said to them. "I didn't come here to England to be a bouncer." "We know, Teddy, we know. So no, you can't pay me." Teddy and Chris were standing there by the door, and it wasn't busy yet, but people were starting to show up. The manager was looking at Teddy with this sheepish expression on his face. Teddy said, "Christ, you really can't get anyone, eh? Well, all right then, I'll take the job. But not for any money, just as a favour." Well, Chris was eager for the same invitation. "Hey, Ted, I'm available if you need backup." Teddy worked the door that night until 2 a.m. He enjoyed the experience, he said. It was hilarious. People had heard, and they'd stopped to chat with him and give him age-old advice. A few guys I had to turn away, but I was friendly with them, and nobody gave me a problem. In fact, some of the tougher-looking guys, who I thought might be a problem, stayed outside with me and became my assistants. "Yeah, Teddy, you can't come in here. You can't come in here. Don't you know who this is? This is the Yank boxing trainer who beat the bejesus out of his predecessor," the manager said. "Christ, Teddy, you're good at this. Can we use you again?" Well, the next day, Teddy received a phone call from Mickey Duff. "I understand you're picking up a few extra shillings. I know you're underpaid, but I never knew you had to fight people to get the jobs." "Screw you, Mickey," spat Teddy venomously. "Maybe I can put you on the undercard against that bouncer," replied Duff sarcastically. More ridicule followed. Teddy got a call from Joey Fariello, who had worked as a trainer for Cus before him and was a good friend. He didn't stop the jibes. He said, "I thought you were training a guy for a world title. Now I hear that you're working the door at a bar." "How the hell did you hear about that?" Teddy asked. Everyone in Gleason's knew. The boxing community was like that. The word had travelled fast. They all wanted to give Teddy crap about it. It was good to have a bit of comic relief. In the end, though, it rang hollow because Chris lost the fight. Chris might have been able to give Graziano a tough time a couple of years earlier, but not now. He had done too much damage to himself with the drinking. Not physically, but psychologically. He was a tentative kid, and when he got in that ring, he didn't feel the warrior mentality the way he should have done. Instead, he felt like the drunken no-good guy who had lied to his trainer. He felt like the guy who was throwing up in the subway at 4 a.m. Graziano was too good, a fighter for Chris to go in against him that way. When Chris lost, Teddy threw in the towel in the 11th round, with his face getting all cut up. It hurt doubly because Chris felt he had let Teddy down. If he had won, he was going to get $300,000 for a fight against Chris Tiozzo in France. It was all set to go, but when he lost, Teddy refused to take his cut of $15,000. Teddy said, "I knew it wasn't the end for me, but I knew it was the end for him. That's why I refused." Back in the States, we met up a few days afterwards in the basement of his house. He wanted to talk to me privately, and he wanted to apologise. He was very sombre, and he was very serious. In the end, he would always take responsibility for his failings. "I want to thank you," he said, "for everything you gave me. You went all out, and you stayed away from your family for all that time, and I appreciate that. I don't feel like I owe an apology to anybody else. I don't owe The Last Dance 125 one to Mickey Duff, but you lived it with me. I wasted your effort and I'm sorry for that. I wanted to give him something to make him feel better. That's the thing that really destroyed you, I said, is that you have a conscience. You knew what was right and what was wrong, unlike some other guys you beat in the gym. But having a conscience isn't necessarily the best thing for a prize fighter. Where it will serve you, long after these other guys have lost their titles, is being a human and being a father. Teddy also said, I was looking at him. His face was still puffy and bruised from the fight. The only thing I ask is that you don't fight again. Will you make me that promise? Chris replied, yeah, if that's what you think. If you were supposed to fight, I'd tell you. But I'm telling you, you're not supposed to fight no more. Chris trusted him, which says a lot about Chris and his loyalty and allegiance. True to his word, Chris never fought again. When Chris had his last kid, Philip, he asked Teddy to be the godfather, and it meant a lot to Teddy because he knew how much thought and care that Chris had put into a decision like this. After boxing, Chris got a job with the electrical union. Chris knew guys in the local 3 who loved him, and they got him a job in the union. He stayed with it for a few years, Chris, but he never liked it, and he wound up starting a demolition business in Little Silver, New Jersey. He just jumped in the way he did with everything. He would tell Teddy about it whenever he talked to him. He told Teddy about how he nearly electrocuted himself knocking down a wall. Teddy got mad at him and said, yeah, that would have been a shame. You got a family, Teddy said. But he learned he started getting blueprints. He became a pro and grew a little business. One day, he got a lump in his throat. He let it go. Teddy hadn't seen him for a while, and he came over and he had this big bulge on the side of his throat. Jesus, Teddy said, how long have you had that? 9 months. Everyone had been telling him to get it checked out, but he kept putting it off. That was Chris. He finally went in and found out it was cancer. By then it was too late. He'd waited too long. If they'd have caught it earlier, he might have had a chance. Chris survived a bone marrow transplant operation, but it took too much out of him. 4 days later, he died of a heart attack at the age of 38. His big, loyal heart just gave out. At the wake, little Philip, Teddy's godson, came up and said to his mother, "Did you ask him?" "No, not yet, but I will." "Ask me what?" Teddy said. "Philip wants to know that you'll train him when he turns 12. His father was supposed to train him, and he said if he couldn't, then you would." Teddy promised that he would. Teddy put together a little tribute on his show on ESPN, cutting together film clips of Chris's old fights, the bagpipes in the ring and him knocking guys silly, crooked, everything. And then it faded to black, with his name up there and the dates of his birth and death. Teddy didn't feel he did as good of a job talking about him as he wanted to. He just got too emotional. He thought he would be able to go right through it, but he got too choked up. Teddy's tutelage of Chris wasn't the only partnership he would forge during this time. His golden opportunities needed a golden boy to epitomise them. And one would arrive. Enter Donnie Lalonde. And that brings an end to the second part of the Teddy Atlas career profile. I hope you guys have enjoyed this story so far. A lot of compelling stories from Teddy himself, direct from his autobiography. You can't get it better than the horse's mouth, can you? And some of the stuff around the Tyson incident is stuff that I already knew about. It's stuff that Jamie, Johnston, anybody that's worked with this podcast, we've all known about this stuff for years. It's always been one of the most notable tales regarding Teddy Atlas and Mike Tyson. But to really deliver it, to really know the intricate details surrounding what had happened and putting it as part of this career profile, it felt like it needed to be an integral part of this second episode on career profiles for Teddy Atlas, because it's a big part of Teddy's career, really, when you think about it. A lot of ifs, buts and maybes, a lot of shoulda, woulda, coulda situations. Would Teddy Atlas have veered him away from the snakes of boxing? Would he have took him to the top? Would he have stayed at the top? Would he have been a better fighter? There's all these questions that we'll never know the answers to, but one thing's for sure, that Teddy Atlas provided Mike Tyson for a period of time with that level of discipline and understanding, and was able to get Mike well on his way to where he became later on down the line in his professional career. It's really been enjoyable to learn about Teddy's relationships with other fighters, his relationships with Mickey Duff, something I didn't know about myself personally. It was also really interesting to hear the stories about him becoming a bouncer as well, which I thought was quite funny to hear about. Not something I'd personally ever heard. So again, these are great little stories that I love making sure are in these episodes. And a big thanks has to go to Jamie Albrecht, who puts these scripts together for these shows. He creates the scripts, he creates the stories, he gets everything together to help deliver what is a fantastic career profile so far on Teddy Atlas. Of course, there is much more still to come, hence why there is another part in Teddy Atlas's career profile. If you have enjoyed the episode, please do let us know. You can go on Spotify and comment below on it by saying, I like the episode, or I didn't like the episode, or it wasn't enough of this. This is your opportunity to provide feedback to us when we're delivering this content to yourselves. If you're not liking the way it's been separated and you prefer it all to be in one big long podcast, that's a bit of feedback that I would appreciate. If you're preferring it being broken down into smaller, manageable, listenable chunks of episodes, then please let us know. I know I said it in the introduction episode to the season, but it's really important to hear from you guys. So if you could let me know if this is working for you guys. Is it better to have it in smaller segments, like an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes? Or is it better to have it in one whole podcast where it's 4 to 5 hours long? Again, I don't personally want to do that because I don't think you guys would get the full story and be able to listen to it. You'd end up going away for a few weeks and then coming back to it. And I don't think it provides you then with the immersefulness of being able to listen to this story and then looking forward to listening to the next part when the next part comes out. That's just me as a listener, guys, as well as a podcaster. But if it's not for you and you want it in one big segment, I need to know if that's what works for you. So please make sure you do leave comments, whether you've listened to it on YouTube or Spotify. They are two of the big places to do it. If you're one of the patrons on patreon.com and you've listened to it earlier, this is a good chance for you to also give us that feedback. Let us know what your thoughts are on it. And if you're not a patron, do check us out at patreon.com, because as I've just said, you will get this episode earlier than everybody else. You'll get all the future series-based content episodes earlier than everybody else. That's a benefit of being a patron, along with the episode being completely ad-free. So just a few more final things to mention before we close time on part 2. Go and find us on social media, on X at career_profiles, or on all other available social media apps at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. If you see any of the videos, any of the social media posts surrounding episodes like this, make sure you share it. Make sure you're putting it out there, letting people know that a career profile's been done. If you see a post on a big boxing page that's got thousands of followers on and someone mentions Teddy Atlas, leave a link below. There's quite a few of you that do that, and we really appreciate it. There's a few of you on X that do it. There's a few of you on Facebook that do it. Even on Instagram. Big shout out to Pinder and Pudsey on Instagram. You always tag us in to a certain topic where someone's talking about it, and you always say, well, BTR have done something on that. Please continue to do that as well. It really is helpful to us. It shows that there are little independent podcasts out there like us that are just as good, if not better, than some of these major outlets that are providing these stories. And sometimes it requires the support and the word of mouth via social media to do that. So please, please, please continue to do it. Continue to leave your comments. Let us know what you liked. If you didn't like anything or elements of it, you need to let me know. It would be really appreciated if you continued to keep dropping them comments on Spotify and on YouTube. And thanks again for all those that are continuing to do that. Well, that is it for this episode. This has been part 2 of the career profile for Teddy Atlas. We really hope you've enjoyed it. We will see you again very shortly for the next part of the Teddy Atlas career profile on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network.